Sega gets a little too literal about its technological arms race with Nintendo in Segaiden episode 47.
How long have you been? I'm talking to a dog.
Simulating 3D space in arcades had been a going concern for Sega since the 1970s. And with the home release of the Sega 3D glasses for Master System, that effort entered the home market as well. The concept of stereo 3D visualization dates back to many decades before the advent of video games, making perhaps its biggest splash in the 1950s with the arrival of movies filmed in an anisotropic format. That is, each film print consisted of twin images, one displayed in red and one in blue. When viewers wore glasses that had paired red and blue lenses, the colored lenses would act as a filter, blocking out the film image of that same color and allowing only images of the opposite color to pass through to that eye. While effective and inexpensive, anisotropic 3D also suffered from a number of drawbacks, most notably the need for tinted glasses that destroyed any sort of color fidelity. An acceptable compromise in the days of black and white film, but an unsatisfactory approach as cinema and broadcast media entered the age of Technicolor. We've already seen a couple of attempts to bring 3D into the gaming space with anisotropic lenses, by way of 3D WORLDRUNNER and Rad Racer for NES. While published by Acclaim and Nintendo respectively, both games came into existence courtesy of Squaresoft and their star programmer, genius Iranian Apple II hacker Nasir Gabelli. We've also seen a more sophisticated attempt to present 3D images with the Virtual Boy, a device that made use of a cutting-edge LED and mirror assembly, but ultimately drew upon visual principles established in the early 19th century. Virtual Boy effectively functioned like a stereoscope, as users secured the system to their faces at such close range that the device could display a unique image for each eye, altering the relative position of objects in each image to force the brain to reconcile the inconsistency by parsing it as 3D space. The Virtual Boy illusion works well, but it suffers from the significant drawback of forcing players to assume a very specific posture and isolating them from the surrounding world in order to engage with the system. With the Sega 3D system for Master System, Sega attempted to find a happy medium between the rigid discomfort of stereoscopy and the destructive color alterations of anisotropy. Their solution? An active shutter system. The tech in the Sega 3D system has its roots in the 1970s, though the fundamental concept dates all the way back to the 20s. The active shutter approach combines the flexibility of anisotropic 3D with the image isolation of stereoscopy. Users wear a pair of specialized glasses, allowing them to move their heads freely, and which work in a way that causes each eye to see a completely different image. The tech gets its name from the fact that each lens functions as a shutter, that is, it opens and closes. The two lenses sync with each other so that one opens while the other shuts, meaning that at any given moment you can only see out of one eye. However, the shutters operate at such a speed that your eye can't perceive the shutters as anything more than an indistinct shadow that darkens but doesn't block your eyesight. In the case of the Sega 3D system, the glasses sync with the approximately 60 frames per second of the NTSC broadcast standard. Perhaps opens and closes isn't the most accurate description here. Maybe it would be better to say reveals and occludes. Where the very earliest attempts at active shutter 3D did make use of physical mechanisms to block the viewer's line of sight, Sega based their design on LCD-based technology dating from the previous decade. Rather than physically block and unblock each eye in sequence, the 3D system simply darkens and undarkens each lens in rapid succession, making use of the rapid response speed of LCD crystals to electricity to create a system that works at the same speed as a television. The overall effect is that the visuals you see while playing 3D games on Master System appear to move at a relatively choppy 30 frames per second, because each eye can only see half of the frames being rendered. But because the game syncs with the shutters, each eye sees every other frame. In order to create the illusion of 3D objects, the game alternates viewpoints each frame. On frame 1, the left shutter closes and you see graphics rendered from the perspective of your right eye. On the next frame, the left shutter opens while the right one snaps shut, and the game renders its graphics from the perspective of your left eye. This makes these games almost unbearable to look at without the proper glasses, since objects within the 3D space flicker back and forth constantly on every frame. So I'll be presenting 3D system games with alternating frames turned off. You'll lose the 3D effect, and things will look choppy, but on the plus side, you won't go away from my channel with a headache. The reality is that the Sega 3D system is yet another Sega gadget that doesn't want to be recreated in the modern era. Like the light phaser, it relies on CRT television technology and doesn't work reliably with flat panel sets, which inherently introduce several milliseconds of display lag that makes syncing with the shutter action a crapshoot at best. And, like the 32X, it has hardware dependencies that mean few clone devices can support it. The Sega 3D system glasses connect to an adapter that plugs, of all places, into the Sega card slot on the Master System. So even the Mr. FPGA system, which offers analog output to CRTs and can make use of peripherals like the light phaser and the NES's ROB through snack controller adapters, can't currently support the 3D system. To my knowledge, the only devices besides a Master System capable of supporting the Sega 3D system are a Sega Genesis with power-based converter and an analog Mega SG with the MyCard adapter running through Analog's proprietary digital analog converter. Whew. Sega ultimately created 8 games for the 3D system, and only 2 of those, Maze Hunter 3D and Space Harrier 3D, have been adapted to work with other 3D visualization technologies on other systems, Nintendo 3DS and Sony PlayStation 2, respectively. So this is a weird little corner of Sega history, but it's one with a proper claim to an older corner of Sega history, as is so often the case with their early console releases. In this case, the 3D system builds on the active shutter mechanism the company built into a little-known VCO object arcade release called Subroc 3D. Now, every student of this channel knows that the VCO object system was Sega's first proper attempt at creating immersive 3D graphics through hardware. The VCO object platform gave us Turbo and Zoom 909, and Yu Suzuki built on the VCO object concept of rendering sprites at different sizes to represent their relative position to the viewer for his superscalar hardware. Well, Subroc 3D took the VCO object platform to the next level by also integrating a physical 3D visualization element into the cabinet in the form of a submarine periscope that lent its scaling objects an even greater illusion of depth. Unsurprisingly, Sega reworked a couple of its Master System interpretations of superscalar titles to use the 3D system, namely Space Harrier and OUTRUN. Games for the actual superscalar system, and subsequent arcade platforms like the Y-Board, never attempted to reproduce Subroc 3D's viewfinder system, because, like Virtual Boy, it prevented non-players from seeing the action. Sega rightly knew that its 3D coin-op hits were crowd pleasers, visual stunners that could draw a crowd on looks alone. And how do you combine a ride-on cabinet shaped like a motorcycle, or a rotating cockpit machine with fixed glasses? You just can't. So in a way, these superscalar conversions to Master System and Sega 3D system represent a curious little archipelago of the company's 3D evolution, a tentative exploration of a path never chosen. Oh, and it's probably worth mentioning that the Sega 3D system invokes the name of yet another major player in the company's history, Mark Cerny. Just as Yu Suzuki headed up the Superscalar project as a result of his passion for cars and math, and just as Yuji Naka pushed home hardware to new heights with his programming prowess, Mark Cerny jumped ship from Atari games after designing Marble Madness to help spearhead major tech initiatives for Sega. And the Sega 3D system may not have been the company's greatest success, but Sega clearly believed in it enough to eventually reissue the Master System under the name Sega Scope 3D, with 3D system launch title Missile Defense 3D built into the console. And we once again have Sega not only beating Nintendo to the punch, but daring to tread where Nintendo of America never dared. The 3D system debuted in July 1987, 3 months ahead of Nintendo's own LCD-based active shutter device, the Famicom 3D system. Of course, one of the first games to support the Famicom 3D system was the aforementioned Rad Racer, or Highway Star in Japan, but only in Japan. Since Nintendo never released the Famicom 3D system outside of Japan, Rad Racer shipped here with red and blue glasses. Well, you know what they say about what Sega does. Sega's first release for the 3D system, Missile Defense 3D, might be the most Sega thing ever. It's a game that requires not one, but 2 peripherals to play properly. Missile Defense 3D defines the concept of a future-proof game. Not as in proof against future obsolescence though, but rather against future play. As the premier title for the Sega 3D system, Missile Defense 3D doesn't simply require the Master System's 3D glasses, it also makes players break out their light phaser. Yes, that's right, it uses not 1 but 2 peripherals built around CRT technology. Like Sports Pad Football, this made it a hefty proposition at the time. Between the $35 retail price of the cartridge and the going price of the glasses, which ranged between $45 and $60, kids were looking at an $80 minimum buy-in for another shooting gallery style game. And its reliance on all of those gadgets makes the game difficult to experience today in its intended form. According to Mr. Walrus on Twitter, Patches exist for Missile Defense 3D that remove the 3D effect by stripping out every other frame of graphics. But the patches can't account for the change in timing that you get by stripping out every other frame of action without hardware or application assistance, so it causes the game to play at double speed. Even my own recording setup didn't work without an assist, so I had to dig up an American Master System and track down an RGB cable for that in order to run this one game. And special thanks is due to Stone Age Gamer for the cable hookup, since without them, this episode would have gone poorly. And then there's the fact that the Sega 3D system lenses are so small they don't fit on the head of most American adults, especially over a pair of eyeglasses. I can only pull it off myself because I was constructed at 85% scale. All of this is a lot of hassle to go through in order to play a game whose core gameplay loop lasts less than 5 minutes. But that's Sega, baby. And hey, Missile Defense 3D is pretty cool once you get it up and running. Fundamentally, it plays like a variant on Missile Command, but that 1980 vintage game concept manages to feel fresh 7 years later thanks to the shift to a first-person perspective. And of course, the incorporation of 3D visualization. As in Missile Command, you play the role of an unseen defense-based technician tasked with preventing incoming ballistics from striking a set of cities. In this case, you only have 2 cities to worry about rather than 3, the inventively named East City and West City, and you defend each location separately. Rather than rolling a cursor around with a trackball in order to create an explosive missile shield, Missile Defense 3D has you simply use your light phaser to shoot at enemy projectiles in multiple phases. This concept was presumably inspired by the American Star Wars missile defense concept, which would have equipped satellites with lasers capable of taking out hypersonic ICBMs as they made their way across the North Pole, presumably from an origin point in the Soviet Union. You begin each city's defense with an opportunity to take out missiles as they launch from the enemy base. Any missiles that slips past your gun sights here moves along to the travel phase, in which you have to shoot the missiles either over the poles or in low Earth orbit. If you miss anything here, you have to move along to the final phase, in which you have an extraordinarily brief window of time in which to prevent the final missiles from reaching their destination. If a single missile slips past, the game ends instantly. The zero margin of error here, as also seen in other nuke-based games of the 80s, reflects not only the realities of nuclear conflict, but also the bleeding heart nature of this era's American game designers, who tended to hail from California and belong to post-hippie online communities like the Whole Earth Electronic Link. In this case, that designer was again San Francisco-born Mark Cerny, who took this opportunity to make a statement about the futility of nuclear conflict just before Perestroika and Glasnost put an end to that nonsense. Well, put a pause on that nonsense for a few decades, I guess. Missile Defense 3D didn't really need the 3D glasses in order to work. This game would play just as well without the active shutter glasses. In fact, I'd argue it might have played a little better with standard 2D visuals. The thing about targeting with a gun designed with iron sights, or plastic sights in this case, is that most people use their dominant eye for lining up shots. I mean, does GOLGO 13 hook up a pair of binoculars to his custom M16? Absolutely not. He targets through a single vision scope with his dominant eye. Many people even close their other eye for more effective aiming while targeting. The entire premise of active shutter stereoscopy conflicts with this tendency. It requires both eyes to take in the simulated stereo visual field. So if you give into those instincts while you play Missile Defense 3D, you're not only shutting out the game's central premise, you're only seeing half the frames of the game animation. The 3D target gallery concept is interesting, but I think this is one of those cases of the designers forcing tech into a premise that would be perfectly fine if not better without it in order to justify a peripheral. Kind of like how Gyromite is a lot easier to play without Rob, you know? And Missile Defense 3D is still just as tough to play on modern televisions as Rob games are. But still, it gave Master System a cool tech gimmick that Nintendo wouldn't bother to reproduce in the US. I mean, sure, we got some 3D games on NES, but those cardboard glasses just don't have the cool factor of a pair of wraparound shades. Well done, Sega. Next time on Segaiden, like the band said, sing a kung fu, kid.